Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock, and we know where we are. So I'm going to call to order the Fort Ord Reuse Authority meeting of the Board of Directors for Friday, April 12th, 2019. And let's see. The next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you'd stand, and Supervisor Phillips, would you lead us in the pledge? And we will be recessing to closed session. And Council, would you let the folks know what we'll be doing in closed session?
Yes, Chair. Thank you. Directors of the board, members of the public, we are going to go to closed session on item 3A, Conference with Legal Counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1. Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court Case Number 17CV4540. That's a pending litigation matter. Item 3B, Conference with Legal Counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners, LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court Case Number 18CV871, also a matter of pending litigation. And finally, 3C, Conference with Legal Counsel, one item of potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9D.
Thank you. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment on any of the items in closed session? All right, seeing none, we will recess into closed session. We're thinking it'll be about a 30-minute experience, so we'll see you soon. Going to reconvene the April 12th, 2019 meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. Council, if you could announce any actions taken in closed session.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Members of the board and public, the board met in closed session on item 3A, Conference with Legal Counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1. Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court Case Number 17CV4540, pending litigation matter. The board heard from counsel and gave counsel direction going forward on that litigation, but there's nothing further to report. Item 3B, Conference with Legal Counsel, Government Code Section 54956.9A D1, Marina Community Partners, LLC versus Fort Ord Reuse Authority, Monterey County Superior Court Case Number 18CV871, matter pending litigation. The board heard from counsel also on that litigation and gave counsel direction to continue forward. And there's nothing else to report out. And finally, on item 3C, Conference with Legal Counsel, one item of potential litigation, Government Code Section 54956.9D. There's nothing to report out.
Thank you. Next, we will hear any acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence that the executive officer has to share with us.
Just two. The first is our colleagues at Caltrans are going to be doing some work along Highway 1, and they happen to choose to do it at this time, in contrast to our friends at TAMC to try to schedule this a little bit at the same weekend and time period that we're having the Sea Otter Classic. So for those of you that get stuck in traffic for one or two of those reasons, just want you to be aware that the 11th through the 14th is the Sea Otter Classic, and folks are having a good time on Fort Ord.
Great, thank you. Next is roll call. Madam Clerk.
Supervisor Parker, Supervisor Phillips, Supervisor Adams, Councilmember Gagliotti, Councilmember O'Connell, Mayor Pro Tem Morton, Councilmember Hoffa, Mayor Oglesby, Councilmember Wizard, Mayor Carbone, Mayor Gunter, Councilmember Garfield, Councilmember Reimers,
Here.
Kathleen Lee, Nicole Hollingsworth, Erica Parker, Todd Muck, Dr. P.K. Diffenbaugh, Steve Monterazzo, Dr. Lawrence Samuels, Colonel Greg Ford, Bill Collins, Dr. Walter Triblee, Lisa Reinheiner, and Dr. Matt Zefferman. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Before we move to the consent agenda, I wanted to, our first business item actually is listed as an ESCA quarterly report, but it's actually authorizing a contract with Arcadis and a group to 2028, which would then obligate the successor agency to continue with that contract. And since Seaside is hoping to be the successor agency on ESCA, we communicated with Craig Malin today, who didn't know that this was on the agenda. So I think before we take on a contract that might impact Seaside or the county or Marina, whoever, whether singly or as a group or whoever ends up being the successor agency, I think at least running it by them would be a good idea. So what I'd like to do is pull this item and ask that it come back after consultation with those jurisdictions. Well, I think as chair I can pull an item, but I would look to. Okay, so great. Thank you.
It makes 5 look better.
Yeah. So I'm being told it's time sensitive. So what's the time sensitivity? Can you consult with them? We're not finalizing the contract with this action. We're authorizing you to sign it. So can you go and talk to Seaside, I think it's the way it's looking. It is Seaside who's going to be the successor agency. But I just think it would be important for the staff to be aware of it and to be okay with the terms, so that when and if they take it on, they're aware. So can you talk with them and then bring the contract back to us next time for approval?
Madam Chair, maybe another solution is we could move that to the end of the agenda, and maybe in the interim, either the mayor of Seaside or the executive director could see if they could get a hold of Mr. Malin. It's just an idea.
I appreciate Councilmember Hoffa, but if the chair is comfortable pulling it, we can pull it. It was my understanding that this would be okay to do today, but if you feel like pulling it and it's not time sensitive, then
Well, I think if your city manager wasn't aware of it, I feel
I would just say if you feel comfortable pulling it, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should. And if we need to extend an existing contract with them for another month or two or whatever we need to do, I just think it's important before we obligate somebody to be in conversation. And to be on the safe side, I think maybe, making sure that the county is in the conversation and the city of Marina, they're all listed as possible successor agencies, either singly or as a group. So I think just to be respectful, that should happen. Okay. Thank you. Any further discussion on this before we?
If the city of Marina is one of the entities in that triumvirate that's being named, we haven't had our staff look at it, our legal counsel look at it, see what it has to say. So I appreciate the chair's motion in support of Seaside being able to review it first, and hopefully they step up.
All right, thank you. We'll move now to the consent agenda. Is there any member of the board who wishes to? I'll do it when we get to the business items. Any member of the board who wants to pull any item on the consent calendar? Yes, Dr. C? Thank you.
Chair, I do have a question on 7G, the
Okay.
building removal quarterly update.
Great, thank you. Why don't we, any member of the public wishing to pull any of the consent agenda items? All right, thank you. So I would entertain a motion to approve the balance. Thank you. Motion by Gunter, seconded by Oglesby. Any discussion on those items? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great, thank you. 7C, Dr. Zefferman.
Thank you, Supervisor Parker. Yeah, so I have basically two things for that. This is the minutes from the March 21st special meeting. The first is that is minor, which is just the representative for MCWD for this meeting was me. It wasn't Keith Vandermartin. The other one is, I think during this meeting, during the acknowledgements portion, I reiterated Marina Coast's position that the references to water augmentation in the proposed legislative language be taken out, and I would like that to be reflected in the minutes. That's all.
Okay, so a couple of corrections and a request for something that happened in the meeting to be reflected in the minutes. Do you want those to come back next time, or are you comfortable going forward with that direction?
I'm comfortable with that going forward with that direction.
So I move approval with those modifications.
Okay, there's a motion to approve the minutes with those changes. Motion by Morton, second by Hoffa. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you for that. 7G.
Yes, thank you, Chair. One question I had was if you could give me some type of a timeline relating to the RFP as far as how long the process would be and when we're looking at the possibility of actually starting something to knock it down. But equally important, is there funding in the CIP for fiscal year 1920 relating to the stockade?
First, the question was about what is the schedule for the stockade, I believe.
Yes.
So schedule would be to go out for bid in the next month or two, and then the bidding process would probably take about a month. And then once the contractor gets mobilized, depending on the schedule that is part of the contract, our most recent one on Surplus 2 was about a 3-month contract. This might be 3 to 6 months because there's quite a bit of asbestos work, hazardous material work to do. So about 6 months after the contract is signed.
And as to the funding in the CIP for 1920, is it?
The current CIP has it fully funded.
And how much is fully funded, amount-wise? You know?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Peter. I think it's 4.36 million in the budget.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So with that, are you comfortable moving approval of that item?
I am. If no one else has questions, yes, I'll move.
All right, a motion by Director O'Connell, second by Phillips. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great, thank you for that clarification. We'll move to business items. That's item 8 on the agenda. What I'd like to do, if the board is willing, is move the consistency determination for the City of Marina Veterans Transition Center housing up to be heard first, and then we'll move into the transition plan discussions. If I don't know who's presenting on that, but Jonathan, okay, thank you.
Okay. Chair Parker, members of the board, thank you for this opportunity to present this afternoon. This is the consistency determination from the City of Marina on the Veterans Transition Center permanent supportive housing. This is at 229 to 239 Hayes Cirque. And I'm going to talk to you about consistency determinations. This is a very brief presentation. FORA's consistency determination requirements come out of state code, state law that created FORA, as well as in FORA's base reuse plan and in FORA's master resolution. There are two different types of consistency determinations. A legislative land use decision automatically comes to the FORA board. The process is to go to a planners working group, then to the administrative committee for recommendation to the board, and finally for a board decision. Today's consistency determination includes both a legislative land use decision and a development entitlement. Today's project has a general plan amendment as well as development entitlements related to a number of different permits and conditional use permits needed for the project. And just a couple of highlights of what's inside each of those. So here's the project site, the location on Hayes Cirque. It's a roughly 2.4 acre site, has existing structures, former Army housing on the site, and these structures would be demolished. This is a site plan that shows the proposed main building. It would have 64 studios, a family wing with 7 two-bedroom units, and a parking area for about 60 spaces. That's on the south end of this map, or the bottom end of this map. And there'd be 50 covered and 10 uncovered parking spaces. In terms of the submittal, so what we have before you includes the permanent supportive housing, initial study, mitigated negative declaration, and it's both legislative and in development entitlement. In terms of consistency, it includes the submittal included consistency resolution from the City of Marina, included their consistency determination analysis table, the submittal worksheet, and a RUDGE checklist. This is within the 1,000-foot corridor of Highway 1, so that's why the RUDGE applied to this project. Okay, so in terms of considerations, so what we look at is that it's generally consistent with the land use designation. In 2005, the Marina General Plan and amendments were previously certified as consistent by the FORA board. It's also consistent with the jobs housing balance. The project adds low-income apartments for an at-risk population. It's also connected to the VTC programs, which includes job skill training. The project also provides for financing of infrastructure. So the project will pay its fair share of the Community Facilities District and property taxes. It's on a public benefit conveyance parcel, so it's not part of the 50-50 land sales split. So our standards for review, we look at land use, intensity and density, the habitat management plan implementation that the project can provide for that. We look at the regional urban design guidelines, different reuse plan policies and programs. We look at the development resource and management plan thresholds, the 6,600 acre feet plus augmented water. Does the project fit within that? Yes, it does. And within the new residential unit cap, the 6,160. We look at the project's ability to do its fair share contribution to the base-wide program, and that it pays prevailing wages. So our recommendation to you, board, is that we conduct a public hearing. We properly notice this in the paper 10 days in advance per the master resolution. On this general plan amendment and the general the Veterans Center Permanent Supportive Housing Development Entitlements. We also ask that you adopt a resolution certifying this consistency. So staff is available. Also, City of Marina staff are available if you have any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from board members at this point? Any questions or comments from the public on this item? All right, we'll close public comment. Anything that the City of Marina wants to say? This has sort of been in your bailiwick.
Yes, just if I may. So I did note in the staff report at page 78 that one of the items that it's stating is it's generally consistent with the base reuse plan, but it actually has a little bit of a higher density than is under the base reuse plan. So the action that City of Marina is asking is that this project, because it serves as your slide references, low-income housing for a at-risk population. For us, we characterized it as low-income housing for our veterans that will be benefited both by the project and by the programs that will be available at that location, including support services from the Veterans Transition Center, which absorbs some of the transportation burdens and different things that a density is what you're considering. So it would seem that the appropriate action is approval with a waiver of that consistency if in fact it's not really consistent. That's my question of council is, we want to get this approved. Is it appropriate to say it's consistent, or is it more appropriate to say with regard to that one element of density that it's waived?
So in terms of the FORA master resolution in state law, the board, when a project comes before the board for consistency, it's either you certify it as consistent or you determine to certify it not as consistent but list recommendations that would make it consistent.
Wow, so okay. That doesn't boxes us in. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Through the chair.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, Director Oglesby, sorry.
No, I think we may have had this a couple years back, and I think it's the board's determination, the board's philosophy, whether it fits into what we think is consistent. And I don't think the density, what we're looking for is that bonus density or the density, so I don't think that's out of the bounds of what we could approve. Because I know we did that years past. Either it is or it isn't. And I think it's consistent even though it's not, even though the density is higher than what we would think. Not require what we would think would be.
I guess a question, so what I thought I heard from both the question and the answer was, so I think what Mr. Brinkman said was that if it's not consistent, which we're hearing it may not be technically consistent, we need to sort of say how to bring it into alliance. And I think the question was, is one option to get a waiver, like so if it's not consistent, it's density where we said it wouldn't be this dense, we like it, so what do we need to do to get it in conformance, right? So is it a waiver? Is it an amendment to the general, to the base reuse plan? What's the mechanism by which we can say yes? Mr. Gagliotti.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, does it even need to be, do we need a waiver or any kind of mechanism here? I mean, we have discretion within this board to kind of define what consistency is, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So then if we do, then we could just determine it consistent as a board.
Okay. Mr. Hoffa.
I would move approval and determine that this is consistent. First of all, I want to congratulate the City of Monterey and the VTC for a good project. Marina. Thank you, City of Marina. But I think that the base reuse plan is like a budget, and budgets are flexible. And the way that I look at this is within the spirit and the scope of the base reuse plan.
And it's generally consistent.
And so I think we can find it consistent. That's my motion.
I'll second it.
There's a motion by Hoffa, seconded by Adams, to call this consistent. And yes, Mr. Oglesby.
Do our council think we need to find some other facts, the other facts on the record, to make it generally consistent? Or I agree with Councilman Hoffa about, this is what we want to happen. We're closing down. It's in the spirit of what we're trying to do. We know it's not exact, but
To the
do we need more?
to the extent we can document and provide basis for the consistency, we should do it.
Yeah, Chair, I would say that all of that evidence has been provided in what you have before you and what City of Marina has already seen. That this project is generally consistent with the base reuse plan. It's the same kind of use that was already described in the area. It's consistent not just with this, but even if you look at our regional urban design guidelines, it calls for increasing densification. So this is more than generally consistent. It's nearly perfectly consistent. They're just a slight adjustment in density, which is a bonus in this particular case.
So may I comment? Just
Please. Yeah.
I am urging that we approve this project. I am just trying to point out this one issue and trying to make sure our motion is fashioned that if we are able to pass consistency as being as generally consistent, I think the density that we are asking for in this project meets what the regional urban design guidelines asked us to do, but the base reuse plan from 1997, it demonstrates how antiquated that document has become. So thank you, everybody, for working through this thinking.
Thank you. Anyone else with comments? I think one of the things is that in the base reuse plan, which, as you point out, is as old as some of us. Anyway, yes, it's getting there. Anyway, it's things have changed since then, and we have a greater commitment to density. And it was trying to focus the density in the more urbanized areas. And as you point out, this is not urbanized per se, but many of the features of an urbanized area, such as transportation and services and all of that, are right there because of the nature of the Veterans Transition Center. So, good discussion. Anyone else with comments before we vote? All right. Yes, please, Mr. Wizard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to support this notion that we want to beef up the record, as it were. But it's my understanding that the City of Marina passed a conditional use permit providing for the intensification of units per acre. And with our discretionary authority to approve acts, consistent or not consistent, it would seem to me that if the City of Marina is saying that it fits in their community and were to determine whether or not it's in general conformance with several tens of thousands of pages of documents, then I think that that's substantial and we can all feel comfortable saying that this is consistent.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Ramers.
Just for the record, on page 78, it does indicate that diversified and integrated housing supply, and it goes on to say that housing shall be constructed at densities and in patterns which conserve land, reduce reliance on the private automobile, and result in walkable, attractive neighborhoods. I think that gives us background for accepting this as fitting.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great, thank you. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? I did public. Yep, thank you. Any opposed? Thank you. Unanimous. Great, thank you.
And for putting the points on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to apologize. I was so busy juggling things around on the agenda that I skipped over item 8A, small I, the actual quarterly update on ESCA. So I apologize, Mr. Cook, for appearing to...
Not a problem. I just was confused.
It's confusing, and I created it. So thank you for coming back.
All right, I'm coming to you with good news. All of the ESCA properties have regulatory certificates of completion on them, so we've passed a huge milestone. I'm also bringing you good news. the AIG cost cap insurance policy has expired, and the Army has committed additional funds to get us to completion of the rest of the ESCA. I do want to note that we're about 2 months away. We have a dynamite ESCA team, which consists of Arcadis, Westcliff Engineering, and Weston Solutions. They've been with us for 12 years now. Actually, they were with us when we negotiated the ESCA. That team will probably be breaking up here in the next 2 months. I'm trying to preserve that team if possible, because City of Seaside had asked that this transition to them, the successors, as seamlessly as possible. They said they want to make it seamless. So I just want to point out there is a time element here. I do recognize we want to talk in more in depth with Seaside staff, and I'm glad to do that. No problem. But like I said, I brought good news. I want to talk to you. Here's the little button. Here is the finances for the ESCA. We've received, let's see if I can find the little. Hey, Jim. There's a laser. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. These are the items here that the Army provided funding for us back in 2017, post-closure MEC find assessments and long-term management. Here's the ESCA funds, administrative funds. This is the update on it through 2018. We received $343,000 from the Army to continue after the AIG insurance. This is accounting up to December 2018. So on your next FORA update, you'll receive the information about that $343,000 additional, and that will be a small amount here for ESCA, administrative funds, and some for the this right here, the ESCA work by the ESCA team of Arcadis, Westcliff, and Weston. And that's my update.
Thank you. Any questions by board members? Any member of the public with a question or comment on this item? All right, I'll close public comment and see if there's any comments by the board, any discussion? All right, thank you. We appreciate your work and bringing us the update. We'll move now to business item 8B. First, the small I is a progress report. Well, I guess, are we having yes, we'll have a transition plan update, and then we'll get a progress report from the RGS team.
Thank you, Chair, members of the board, members of the public. Sherry Damon, Risk Manager, Prevailing Wage Coordinator. I'm going to be giving the legislative update piece of this, and then we'll be handing it over to the Assistant Executive Officer to begin the transition plan progress report, and then it will go to the RGS consultant team. Here's what we're going to talk about today. So, overview, we're going to talk about SB 189 and SB 533. As many of you know, these are the two pieces of legislation that were introduced by Senator Monning to address transition plan related issues. One with respect to the extension of the Community Facilities District, and one with respect to the issue of prevailing wage and how to handle future enforcement of that. Then we're going to get the progress report and go on from there. So you saw this last time. I just happen to like this slide. It just is a great graphic representation of the caterpillar of making a law. And I have to say, I was in Sacramento recently, and there's a lot of that. We're still down at the green, yellow part of that caterpillar in the overall process. So I outlined the more simplified version of this. You have an introduction, you have committee hearings, and then it goes to the floor hearings. And finally, if it successfully makes it through all those places, it goes to the governor's desk to either sign or send back. So let's talk about SB 189. This is the piece of legislation that flows out of the legislative package that FORA sent to the senator's office. It does not exactly reflect what the FORA board approved, so I'm going to summarize it quickly. It extends FORA in a very limited capacity until 2022, and that would be including extension of the Community Facilities District. It creates a 5-member board with a 1-vote majority vote, so changing the voting structure. It does extend the FORA Community Facilities District, and it importantly allows for boundary adjustments by filing a revised map. That is a new piece of legislation that is different from the Mello-Roos district laws, so that's a good thing. It eliminates some of the process of revising district boundaries. It extends the property tax and provides that the revenue stream continues post June 30th, 2022 if it's for a FORA debt that exists on June 30th, 2022. That's the way the law is written currently. It does include a CEQA exemption for the transition plan, and it retains the 50-50 land sales revenue split until 2022. So that's kind of the high-level summary. There's a whole bunch of words and a whole bunch of strikeouts and underlines, but that's the essence of what that bill, as it's currently drafted, as of April 1st draft, does. Here's how it compares to the FORA-approved package. We had a section, we wrote one section, which was the 6700. What was presented by Senator Monning does not do that. It rewrites the entire FORA Act, and it takes the pieces of the legislation that we drafted, and it deletes certain things and adds certain things in the overall Authority Act. So there's more code sections that are included in the SB 189. It does include the definitions, some of the definitions that we included in the FORA legislation. It does address the transition plan. That's something that we addressed in the FORA propounded legislation. It does address, and the reason why it's yellow, it's not an exact match. The FORA environmental review was the transition plan is not a project. The Senator Monning legislation clarifies or says it's exempt. So that means it is a project, but it's exempt from CEQA. It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference. He did limit the scope of the authority post June 30th, 2020. So that was good, pretty much on all fours with the FORA proposed legislation. He changed the board structure and voting structure, and that's a yellow check because most of what we asked for we got, with the exception of the FORA board included California State University Monterey Bay as a voting member, and he has removed that. But you might recall we discussed the issue of the odd number of people on the board in terms of making sure that you always had a majority, so you could do that one vote, as opposed to having, for example, a 3-to-3 split, and then your votes would fail more frequently. He did address the powers and the requirement for a budget. He did outline the scope of authority. He did not adopt or incorporate the concept of regional planning. He did include the extension of the CFD only for 2 years. I think the FORA legislation would have made it until the agreements were in place and some other conditions had been met. He did not adopt the automatic dissolution, and he did not clarify the LAFCO FORA, how that works. He left it essentially like it is today in the legislation. So that's how it compares. So where is that bill now? That bill made it through the governance committee. It was unanimously passed through with technical amendments, and what those technical amendments are, for the most part, are correcting typographical errors and adding expanding community facilities district, including the Mello-Roos citations, very technical changes, nothing substantive at this point. They passed it to the Appropriations Committee. So the next committee meetings happened the last week in April 22nd, anywhere through May 17th. Once it passes through the next committee, it can be, if it's not re-referred to another committee, it can be passed to the Senate floor for discussion. And once it passes there, it can be amended at the Senate. But once it passes through there, it can go to the Assembly floor, and it needs to pass through there. It can be also re-referred, I think, back to committee during that whole process. So ultimately, October 13th is the last day for the governor to sign new pieces of legislation if it makes it through. SB 533. This is the other proposed bill that has amends the FORA Act, and it addresses the issue specifically of prevailing wage. It is very broad as it's currently drafted. It makes projects that are subject to the FORA resolution, a deed restriction, or a covenant, a public work. So that would apply across the base. Every project out there would be a public work, which would kick in the requirements for prevailing wage and all the other requirements that go hand in hand with public works projects. It requires contractor and subcontractor registration with the Department of Industrial Relations. It authorizes the Labor Commissioner to enforce. It does apply retroactively, and it survives repeal of the Authority Act. So in June 30th, 2022, the Authority Act is repealed. This section, though, would survive the repeal by the terms of this draft legislation. I would just note that this is broader than what the master resolution and what the FORA policies are as of today in terms of enforcing prevailing wages and the applicability of a prevailing wage across the base. That particular bill is scheduled to be heard in the Labor Committee on or about April 24th. If it passes through there, it most likely will get amended there or before there. But if it passes through there, it'll probably have to go to a fiscal committee. It may have to go to a fiscal committee and end up, May 17th is the last day for those committee hearings to happen. Generically, floor hearings are May 3rd to September 13th. And again, the last day for the governor to sign is October 13th. So there are plenty of opportunities yet to revise the language on that bill. And I know that the labor it has weighed in with the senator's office on this. I think they are generally in favor of this. I can also relate that in my capacity as your prevailing wage coordinator, you might recall that we've had over the past couple of years workshops with stakeholders and with the Department of Industrial Relations. And one of the issues that came out of that was a request or an exploration of what it would take for the Department of Industrial Relations to become an enforcer of the contractual provisions that are in the settlement agreements, for example, on certain projects that say we agree we're going to pay prevailing wage, to the deed restrictions that are in certain on certain properties. Not every property on Fort Ord has the deed restriction because some of those transfers have happened outside, like for example, the Seaside Golf Course and the Seaside Highlands projects. Those properties transferred outside of the FORA process, so they don't have the same kind of deed restrictions vis-a-vis prevailing wage, compliance with the master resolution, compliance with the base reuse plan, that properties that transferred through FORA have, and through the economic development conveyance. So labor has weighed in, the development community has weighed in. They have recognized that this is very, very broad. In fact, it's overbroad, and FORA has weighed in, noting to the Senator that as this is currently drafted, it is far broader than what the FORA policies are. The exemptions aren't there. It's not limited to first generation construction. there are a series of potentially unintended consequences of this legislation as it's currently drafted. So I'm expecting some pretty major revisions in the next month on this. So this is one to keep an eye on and definitely to participate on. So where are we? This is where we are on those bills. We're right there in the early part of the process. My point being what I already said. You still have some time to make some tweaks and changes to the actual language, and I still expect there to be tweaks and changes to both bills as we move forward closer to the floor hearings and finally, hopefully, to the governor's desk. So what's next? More committee hearings, additional language tweaks, and support and opposition letters. It's a little bit premature for the actual support and opposition, at least from comments that we've received from the senator's office. Of course, he will always accept those, but the language is not in a form where it's final enough and at committee, through enough committees to say, I support this bill, because it's going to get revised, and there's a knowledge that's going to be revised pretty substantially. And that's especially true with SB 533. SB 189, I also expect some changes to come out of that one as well. So by the end of April, certainly the end of May, maybe the beginning of June is when the time frame would be for support and opposition letters. And definitely work through the senator's office on that is his request through us to you. And Michael, I'm going to turn that over to you on anything additional you want to add on the legislative part before I turn it over to the Assistant Executive Officer for the Transition Plan Progress Report.
Yes, I just like to point out a couple of items. And in our board report, we did note that there are a couple of additional pieces of legislation that will affect the Fort Ord Reuse Authority that are making their way through the committee process as well. And just to pay attention to those, because they're changing the percentage requirements for adopting new financing districts, which is a benefit to several. There's several new bills that, in fact, while we were in Sacramento, after I'd reported to the executive committee, Senator Monning's request that we be available, while we were there were reports specifically about fire prevention, which is a major concern here at Fort Ord. In fact, Chief Orquides from the county was there. Watching that process, there were two bills looking to reinstate redevelopment in the state of California. There was significant conversation about the importance of redevelopment for all jurisdictions. There was an ongoing conversation about the water bill and the importance of reestablishing ways to create water for our jurisdiction. So there were a number of things that happened. So I would particularly suggest people look at ACA 1, and there are many others. And so at a future meeting, after we take that to the legislative committee, and Chair Phillips will be doing that soon, so we'll take that for your consideration. Senator Monning's representatives are not here today, but he did ask me to make sure that that the board understood that we really, I want to reemphasize what Sherry said twice, that we really are just beginning the process. The bill that passed out of Governance Committee did pass out unanimously on Wednesday on its way in. That doesn't mean approval. That just means it's the first step of the process. And we were there to be able to respond to any technical questions, and we did testify to the fact that the bill, as currently structured, implements many of the components of what the Fort Ord Reuse Authority has adopted, but it is not directly consistent, and it misses in a couple of areas. So we just pointed that out. 3, he said there may be some technical issues and some corrections that need to be made on parts of the bill. He did indicate that comments should be submitted to his office if there's those that have them to be made, and that he does, as Sherry pointed out, that both 189 and 533 will have significant additional hearings coming up. So I want just mention those, Chair.
I noticed that one of the directors had a question on just the legislative aspect. I don't know if that's...
Sure, why not? Good idea. Did you have a question?
I did have a couple questions. So addressing Senate Bill 533, that how pervasive it is in the sense that it's any project on the former Fort Ord is going to require prevailing wage. So the question that I have is, does the resolution of the board, the deed restrictions, or a covenant being the trigger that is prevailing wage? So somebody that purchased a home here on former Fort Ord, because the base reuse plan is recorded, the master resolution is recorded against their title, is that treated as a covenant that when they hire a contractor for painting or re-roofing, technically it seems that this would put them within, that they are required to hire a prevailing wage person. So you are reading it the way
I'm reading it that way, that as it's currently drafted, and it's not just prevailing wage, I would note, the way it's currently drafted, it would make that property and every project on that property a public work. Now, think about that, cities, because we bid projects, we bid public works projects routinely. Imagine the private homeowner buys an encumbered piece of property, not going to know how to do a public works bid process. You also pay for everything beyond prevailing wage. You're paying for the training fund, the apprenticeship funds, all the other things that are there. So in that respect, it is very, very overbroad, I think, and has some flaws.
overbroad and perhaps oppressive is the word you're looking for.
Perhaps.
The other portion that I noted is that it also seeks to apply this subdivision shall apply retroactively to work performed prior to the effective date of this section. So to all those people that I just commented might be oppressed, and those of us that have projects that have been done in our jurisdictions for a period of time, retroactive application to penalties could be onerous, burdensome, and lead to significant litigation.
I would concur with that as well, that the retroactive application seems unwarranted and causes a huge host of issues. We already have seen some of those issues when the DIR changed the interpretation on certain projects, and they had been following one route, and doing what they thought they were supposed to do, and then all of a sudden they found out, oh, whoopsie, we should have been going down this other road because the rules have changed. So one of the things you want on Fort Ord, and one of the things I think that is important for the region, is this, not just the paying the prevailing wage, but the stability and the certainty for the development community to invest in our community and make sure that we attain what we are trying to, we collectively, the base reuse plan, the region is trying to do with respect to the reuse of the Fort Ord lands.
So with regard to this board, I think our discussion, and I'm asking Sherry as our prevailing wage director, is that we have been, as a board, trying to ensure that prevailing wage is paid for all first generation projects on the former Fort Ord, consistent with the master resolution, and secondarily that if it's in a contract provision, as is the case with so many of our first generation, that the labor department would enforce those contract provisions, but not extend to every single thing that happens now and into the future on anybody.
I hear you. This is not scheduled for action item, but I can assure this board that I am well aware of what this board's policy is. I do think there's this legislation could be simplified on just the enforcement side and say the DIR is empowered to enforce blah, 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 and a much more limited scope in terms of how you do it. I do think the registration piece of this is a good piece of it that is consistent with the FORA board policies requiring registration of contractors on those projects. But if the goal is to enforce the FORA policies and the contracts and the deed restrictions and the first generation construction requirements, it strikes me that you want to just provide the enforcement authority to the Department of Industrial Relations. That is my suggestion. I've kind of put those comments out there already based on the FORA board policy directions.
So the follow-up question is, does this then go back to the legislative committee to write letters of opposition or to suggest alternative language? How do we address this, that this just isn't sailing through with adverse and unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think the legislative committee will have to be scheduling a meeting sometime the next couple of weeks, and while it's not an action item, I can take this as general direction of the board to take that back for legislative committee action.
In addition, drafting a letter suggesting the language that I just suggested as the enforcement language. I mean, we could even help it along, because I think you need the language to the senator sooner rather than later for those. If you go back, flip it back 3.
But that's my concern. And
right, it's a timing issue. I got it. It's a timing issue. So we want to get that language. If the FORA board wants to direct staff to prepare some comment letters to the senator's office suggesting changes, we could certainly draft that and take it and run it with the legislative committee to get that forward and timely to the senator's offices so that he can consider that. Orally, we've already made some of those comments, just so you know.
So the other question on the other bill, I have many questions, but I get that you're not the author of it, so I will direct those questions to the author. But you did make the representation, and I know that you and Mr. Hulamard have had many communications with Senator Monning. You made the statement that his proposed SB 189 rewrites the entire Four-Door Reuse Authority Act into the Government Code. But I do note that while the bill has certain code sections identified as being repealed, omitted from that list are many code sections. And so I read it as being that those code sections are remaining in effect. You've read it, or at least as I understood your comment, for example, Government Code Section 67675, 67679, 67680, 67680.5, 67691 are not either repealed or amended in this. But
they stand as it's currently drafted. Those provisions would remain in the Authority Act. However, 67675, when you look at the SB 533 legislation, is repealed. I just don't know why.
Okay. So in fact, this legislation is not a complete rewrite. We need to read the act plus this legislation to see
you do.
Which terms. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Let's see, Michael, you
I
had
just
something
wanted to add that while, since it's not an action item, what I would propose is if the timing is at issue on the specific issue about 533, we already know what FORA board policy is. We can prepare comments on this new item as it pertains to current FORA board policy and review that with the chair and the chair of the legislative committee before sending. And that way we get the comments at least reviewed without having the stress of having the legislative committee get it all together and take a formal action if we stay consistent with current FORA board policy.
That sounds fine. My question would be, should it be reviewed by the admin committee in the sense that these are the city managers that are doing most of these contracting?
I've no opposition to that at all, but it's really the legislative committee and the board that takes positions.
Takes policy, but I'm just, the language also is, either way.
I'll review it with Lane.
Okay, thank you.
Please support. CSUMB pays prevailing wage on all work done at the university, but we're very concerned about the overly broad language of 533, and we think particularly in the area of designating all work done in the public work sphere is a wrong-minded way to go with enforcement. I think that a more narrowly defined language would be far better for developers and municipalities that are partners of our university. on SB 189, I think the university understands the decision to create a more realistic voting plurality and go with 5 voting members. But as an institution, almost wholly constrained within the boundaries of former Fort Ord, we feel that we should have an ex officio role at the table. So just wanted to note that for the board, and we would appreciate any support that might be forthcoming in that matter.
Thank you. Let's move along then to the next phase of our transition plan update. Thank you.
Sorry,
Dr. Diefenbach.
sorry. I just have a question around SB 189 for the property tax that provides a revenue stream to continue post June 30th, 2022. So if, for example, FORA authorizes sales of bonds prior to 2022, the property tax post that would pay off those bonds?
Yes.
So I'd be interested to know, and maybe it's a question for Senator Monty, but the fiscal impact to the school district for loss of property tax revenue. So I don't know if you can get me that information, or if I have to go to Senator Monty, but any direction would be helpful that way.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Dr. Zefferman.
At least having the switch I can push. Okay, so I just, a lot of the residents of our district live in the former Fort Ord, and there's been a lot of people interested in making comments on this legislation, and I've been passing along the link to Senator Monning's office. I think I got from the FORA staff, and it might be driving some confusion, because when you go on that website and you go and select the topic that you want, there's 2 related to FORA. There's FORA support and FORA oppose. And so I think that drives people to either supporting or opposing FORA when they go to the website. And I don't know to what extent you're communicating with the office, but if they want people not to be supporting and opposing at this point, they might want to make a more neutral topic on their website.
It's not you can oppose or support a bill at any point in the process. It's just, this is a request that we are passing through from the senator's office, that the language is going to change so much between now and, I would say the end of April, maybe May, that supporting today or opposing today might be supporting tomorrow.
I guess my point is that on their website it forces you to pick either support or oppose, and if it's frustrating them, they might want to consider changing their form. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, I've been known to impersonate the executive officer on TV, but I didn't want to impersonate a lawyer. So moving right along to just summarizing the FORA staff report, the 3 elements that we think are the most salient are that this board is in compliance with the state law that required it to submit the 2018 transition plan. So that is in effect. In addition, the board requested that staff secure consultants who could act as facilitators to work through what we've been calling transition planning implementation agreements, implementing agreements, and that contract is currently about halfway through. And then as we've gone through in considerable detail, Senator Monning's legislation is on a separate track. So moving on to just a facsimile of the process, you can see kind of the 2 tracks that we're following. Implementing agreements that are being developed by the facilitators in consultation with the FORA jurisdictions themselves, and also with the specific resource entities, meaning Transportation Agency of Monterey County and Marina Coast Water District, and the other agencies that would be taking on the work. And then on the legislative side, primarily relating to what laws continue in effect and also what revenue streams. Drilling down a little bit deeper into the implementing agreements, they essentially correspond to an option I had included in a report to this board some 3 years ago, which we were calling function transfers, which entails the Fort Ord Reuse Authority going away as of a specific set date and all the major functions being transferred to agencies that will pick up the work that FORA was doing previously. The implementing agreements are essentially reimbursement. They will deal with reimbursement agreements and just how to take on some of the things that FORA had obligations to handle, and how they might put together replacement financing districts and create their own impact fees, and then any additional agreements between the jurisdictions that there is a desire to put together, and then other post-FORA governance and administrative issues that would be developed. And then finally, because graphs are starting to become in vogue here at FORA, we just illustrated the main functions that FORA has been handling these last 20 plus years: transportation, habitat, water augmentation, and the ESCA Army cleanup. I would also add building removal is the fifth major function that we have been handling, and Jonathan will be following this report with his own report on the status of that process. So with that, I'm going to bring your consultants up and hand it over to them.
We want no more wounding in these rooms, please. Again, I'm Kendall Flint with Regional Government Services, and I'm here today to basically give you our update for sort of where we are in the process. As Steve and Sherry mentioned, I think we're about halfway through our negotiations and talking with all the member agencies and whatnot. We still have a ways to go. I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights of what we've got going on right now, and then I want to chat a little bit about an upcoming workshop that the executive officer and the RGS team would like to schedule between the admin committee and the board for us to be able to go through and seriously talk about some of these issues which we need to resolve in order for us to complete those agreements. First of all, it's so rare, but it does happen. The admin committee was very supportive across the board about the idea of taking on the local projects that are currently listed in the capital improvement plan. Now let me be clear, the implementing agreements are not the CIP. These are two separate things that are happening on twin tracks, right? But that being said, in our implementing agreements, one of the things we want to do is make sure that everyone knows who's responsible for what projects once FORA has sunset. Now the conversation on this one was predicated on three things. One, the group wanted to make sure that in the 2019-2020 CIP, that South Boundary Road would be funded and completed, or completed in a reasonable amount of fashion, and also the General Jim Boulevard and South Boundary Road intersection. The third item that came out of that conversation related to the completion of the EIR for the Northeast-Southwest connector. So the thought around the board at that particular time, around that particular meeting, was that we all agree that we will take the projects that are in our jurisdictions that affect our local agencies, and each agency, each municipality would develop its own impact fees to charge developers in order to pay for that piece. So nobody's getting a pass in terms of the development impact fees, but it is different, and these folks were seeing that they would like to be able to take that on their own. All of these projects obviously would be listed within the within the implementing agreements, and then we would have a discussion later about what would happen in terms of these impact fees. Now, each of the jurisdictions would be responsible for their own impact fees, and unlike the Community Facilities District, those all have to be done through a nexus study, which we did talk about with the city managers and folks, so they understood that. It's a different process, and it does take some time, which is another reason why it's important for us to get all of these agreements in process as soon as possible, so there's adequate time for each agency to work these through their own attorneys and their own communities to make sure that they can get them going. Now, when it came to the regional projects, I would say that the discussion was a little more spirited.
Regional projects are those that are identified in the current capital improvement plan for FORA, and then TAMC also has its own regional projects. And we had pretty much a split decision, which was half wanted to say, all right, moving forward, we'd like to see these regional projects flow out of TAMC, out of FORA for responsibility and go to TAMC. Some of the agencies, including the City of Monterey and Delray Oaks, had some concerns about that, and they were specific to the idea that TAMC may use fees outside of the FORA footprint. And I believe that Todd at the time was explaining that while there would be a percentage that could potentially go out, it's because the way they calculate their impacts is a little different. And so, yes, it would be possible that funds connecting SR 68, 156, or others may be contributed to from impact fees charged on FORA properties. Now, that being said, everyone in the room did have an agreement that they wanted to see a consistency with funding for Monterey Salinas Transit. And I also want to point out that in our meetings with all of the local educational facilities, we heard the same thing, that it was really important that there was connectivity within the community, not only for those people going to school, but also just in general for connecting folks. TAMC staff has already taken a look at what their fee structure might look like, and we are going to be bringing that back at a later date so we can really do a compare and contrast. But the thing that the admin committee wanted me to make sure you're aware of, which is true, the CFD has a different criteria for the funds amount they can set. So when you shift from a CFD, Mello-Roos, to a Nexus base, it will be less money. It will not be as much. Now, they can make some adjustments at TAMC, to take on and increase funding for MST. They can do all those things, but at the end of the day, the board needs to understand that there will be a difference. Now, when you look at the legislation, that may be a moot topic, because if the CFD sunsets at 2022, it's going to sunset at 2022 anyway, and at that point, you'd be having to look for another means of funding those projects with regard to the regional projects. This is one of those areas that we would want to discuss with the board and with the admin committee to figure out what the pleasure might be in terms of how we approach that moving forward. Now, the other area we spoke about was Marina Coast Water District. The folks from the agency made a really good presentation to the admin committee and outlined for them their plan for transition agreements. One of the things that they committed to was the ability to guarantee the same the same water allocations that are currently specified in the FORA agreements. And there was considerable discussion about what was going to happen later with moving things around, if there's going to be groundwater, water augmentation, all those things. The way that we left it at that particular meeting was that MCWD will be drafting an agreement that we expect to see sometime next week, within pretty much a week prior to our next meeting to discuss that, which would be May 1st. And again, that's the purpose of that, is to give the cities an opportunity to look at it and see if there are problems or challenges, so we meet on the 1st, we're able to address those moving forward. MCWD has also indicated that they would like to take over future capital improvement projects and programs as it relates to FORA, which would make them be the implementing agency post-FORA moving on. Now, the other piece of this that I think everyone is aware of, the Habitat Conservation Plan, DDA is going to have that document coming out relatively soon here. The idea here is that there will be a joint powers authority that is established post-FORA, and that would include 13 members that would be in charge of basically implementing the HCP. And one of the questions we have is basically how long to continue that funding through the Community Facilities District, obviously, and then when or if that goes away, those shortfalls also have to be addressed. And that may be either through local agencies' contributions or by sale of land. There's some question about whether or not the land sales would be adequate to set up a endowment type of source funding to make that go on and on forever. Now, what we're continuing to do at this point is meet with all the various agencies. We've just got a few left to go. We're trying to be as broad as possible and remain as objective as possible. So that means that we are speaking with folks on the environmental side, from labor, from the development community, all of the member agencies, as well as, of course, travel, tourism, and business interests within the community. We are continuing to update those lists, and at this point, we're taking a look at also employee transitioning, blight removal, and ESCA to the extent that they would affect the implementing agreements. As an example, one of the things that we're going to have to figure out is post-FORA, who will take care of records retention,
public records requests, this sort of thing. So we'll be talking to the various agencies about those that have an interest in taking on those tasks or not, or what the plan might be moving forward to making that happen. And obviously you'll be continuing to see us with regular updates moving on. So our meeting on the 17th, which is next week, we are going to be talking about those post-FORA roles, what folks might want to be or interested in playing, and also, of course, a brief update on housing. And the opportunity for a regional housing element, which actually is going to wind up being pushed back over to FORA staff, I believe. On the 1st, we'll be looking at the review of the water agreements and then also going through any other unresolved issues. We're hoping sometime between then and before we come back to the May 10th board meeting, if at all possible, that we could have that discussion, workshop, whatever you want to call it, with this board and with the admin committee, again, to go through these issues and resolve as many of them as we can. Because the longer we wait to do that and have those discussions, the more difficult it is for us to actually develop agreements that can go through all of your various systems in order to be adopted. If we're able to do all of those things, we believe we can get the Marina Coast Water District agreements, some of the others done sooner rather than later, but we would have a structure available at the very latest, draft agreements coming back to the admin committee in June and then coming to the board for their look-see in June as well. With the idea being that if we can work through all these different issues, if we can incorporate those things that are coming out of the legislation and then leave those portions open for adaptation to the legislation as it might change, then we'll have documents that can go through the process in the fall, which would give you adequate time to approve, adopt, and then when we come back in January 2020, we're not racing blindly anymore. We actually have something in place. So that really concludes my presentation. And of course, I'm available to answer any questions that you might have about that process.
All right, board members, questions about the process? Director Ramers and then Director Wizard.
Yes, I do have questions. This is just one that I want to make clear at first. I think there's been some misunderstanding. I've been told that Carmel indicated they weren't interested in being interviewed. And if that was given as an indication, that is not an accurate indication, and I apologize if there's any misunderstanding. I wanted to make it very clear that our mayor would like very much to have a conversation. Great. And has authorized numbers and information for me to give to you so that you can be in touch with him. He and Carmel are very interested in the transition as it affects while we do not own property, we are very much interested and concerned about the entire community and all of our communities, and that we work together. So if that was an understanding, it was a misunderstanding. I'm
absolutely happy to hear that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is related to item BI2, and so perhaps that, however, it might be more along the lines of Ms. Damon's realm of expertise.
So could you say what the words are? Because BI2 doesn't tell me. That looks like the transition plan transportation study. I don't think we're there yet.
We're not there yet, I don't think, right?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. So item B, sub-item I, yes. Sub-item 2. Not transition plan transportation, but receive Fort Ord Reuse Authority transition plan progress report. I have a yes. question about that.
Great.
So my question has to do with our PERS obligation, and I realize that we've been sending letters to people letting them know that we plan on terminating our contract, and as is appropriate with our transition plan rather. And I'm curious to know what planning or preparation we've done to not cancel. Well, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but to prepare for what could be an extension of FORA past June 30th, 2020, if we're turning PERS off, and who's left to absorb that.
Would you like me to respond, Madam Chair, members of the board? So right now the board has taken step one. It's adopted a resolution of intent to terminate. That doesn't mean you are going to. You have 1 year. In 1 year, so in January, you have to take a second action to pull the trigger on actual termination of the PERS contract. So that's the first part. You have the ability to change your mind at the January time. simultaneously, as soon as you did the resolution of intent, that set in motion a whole slew of activities. We sent that to the CalPERS department, the state board. They are going through the process of preparing an actuarial analysis of what the terminated agency liability will be. That unfunded liability is anywhere currently estimated in the range of $9 to $16 million. It's quite a large range. May have those numbers wrong because I'm pulling them off of my head just like that, but I think it might be a little less than that. But in any case, this board last month authorized another $1 million to go into the 115 trust, which can only be used for retirement purposes. So it can only be used really to pay off that obligation. So you have 6.7 already set aside for that. You have some additional cash funds on hand that you could use now, or you could, and the original concept was to encumber property tax revenues to pay the gap between what we have in the 115 trust and the cash piece of it that is going to be needed to buy out that contract. So that is where you are. You have some options. The actuarial report is anticipated on or about April 22nd. According to CalPERS, I've been emailing them with some regularity and frequency to try to get them to stay on schedule to get that analysis, because it needs to come to FORA for the budget preparations. It kind of plays into these entire discussions. You really don't know what kind of budgetary demands you have until you get that number and you know what the actual number is, and that number actually stops liability for retirement obligations as of the date of termination. Does that answer your question?
That we would know on or before October 13th whether or not our obligation should be continued is
yes,
more or less the answer. Thank you.
Yes, Director Morton.
So if FORA is extended to 2022, then that PERS obligation will continue to rise.
It may or may not continue to rise. It really depends on a whole bunch of factors. As the transition plan is currently drafted now, and I believe the FORA staff is anticipating that as of June 30th, 2020, all of the existing FORA staff and institutional knowledge go away, and that the future board will be utilizing its own staff and resources and making new contracts to do that, and that might include retaining or having a new PERS contract or some other method of retirement planning for its employees. We don't know that.
Okay, so that's reading Senator Manning's legislation. That is not clear, and that's what I'm trying to understand. So even if FORA is extended under SB 189, what's anticipated by somebody
by the
here,
transition plan.
The transition plan is that we would go ahead and terminate FORA's participation in PERS effective June 30th, 2020.
That is the anticipation, but I will tell you that if you do that, the future board will not have the opportunity to go back into PERS for a period. I think it's a 5-year period. There's a time block when you do that where you can't get back in. So if it turns out that the successor board doesn't really have the resources on its own staff and it wants to retain staff who say, you know what, guess what, I'm not working for you unless I get PERS, it could cut off some of your opportunities to retain the staffing for the future board.
So the follow-up to that is looking at his code legislation. Community Facilities District, he defines this, meaning Senator Manning's bill. I don't mean he did it personally, but Senator Manning's bill defines Community Facilities District revenues, means the revenues collected from the authority. So
that's there's been a technical amendment to that language, and we anticipate another technical amendment coming to that language.
Okay, so you've caught that. And then the question is that this legislation appears to mean that the sources of revenue are going to be the CFD, the tax increment, land sale revenues, and rents. So from which of those, if we are continuing our PERS obligation, would we pay going forward?
would you pay from, the source of revenues to
Yes,
pay
for the PERS.
so I believe depending on the amount of work, probably less from the CFD, although now you can pay some PERS liabilities from the CFD because your FORA staff works on and manages the CFD, so that's an appropriate charge to the CFD revenues. The property taxes and land sales would be the only two other revenue sources that would be available for that. And, I think that we're not anticipating a lot of land sales revenues by 2022. So you're really looking at the property tax revenues. And I would say that the terminated, unfunded agency liability is not likely to rise much in two years. So right now your 115 trust is generating about anywhere between 100,000 to 300,000 plus a year. So the longer you leave that 115 trust and those amount of monies in the trust, you're likely to generate more than enough to hit any potential increase, because you don't have the same staffing levels in the successor agencies, reduced scope of jurisdiction. You're no longer doing consistency, you're no longer doing planning, you're no longer really doing projects, you're collecting monies and you're distributing monies. So it's very hard. I don't know how much more to give you. It's hard to give you a projection because I don't know what the successor board might want or can consider that they need.
So that reflects back just to the earlier statement that many of the code sections that are not identified in his legislation that remain in effect still have some of those powers of management of the CIP, et cetera, going forward. So those are two inconsistent principles, so thank you.
Director Garfield and then Hoffa.
Okay, I thought I understood something and now I don't. So I recall back when Ms. Rodriguez was giving us information about how we could use this termination. And I think we should clarify my recollection with her was that we have the option to fully terminate a known date's liability to PERS, whether the entity goes forward or not.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure PERS would consider Mauning's Bill 189 a continuing entity or not.
It is a continuing entity. I can answer that. I think the way it's drafted, my understanding, it's a continuing entity, and I don't think that's inconsistent with Ms. Rodriguez's statement to you. This board has the option at any point to terminate the CalPERS contract, and you've taken the procedural steps that are required under the law to do that before the expiration of the agency. So
my point was that the termination liability could be completely met without exiting PERS, therefore keeping the option open without that period of time to not be able to return. So that's not an
I get it.
Okay.
I get it.
So the
115 trust may have enough in it to cover all of that amount without actually terminating the contract. I think that's what you're saying. That we might have cash on hand to address the full termination value without actually terminating the contract. Right?
Terminating the liability is not the same thing as terminating the contract. So we terminate the liability in one way or another, either in total by June 30th, 2020, by what's on hand or already allocated for it, with the proviso that if it's less than $6.7 million, I'm buying the drinks.
Yes.
Not likely to happen. Pretty safe on that. But I really want to be sure that we're not leaving the folks that are going to still be at the table in a way disadvantaged. And I think that's an important thing to consider is that it needs to be fairly done so that they're not dragged along with what we should settle now. And so that is one question. And along that same line, I do have another question that may not be appropriate here, but I'd like to voice it. whatever happened to the entitled versus planned development? You're talking about a CFD that needs to be replaced, but we're not talking about whether those need to continue the arrangement for the previously entitled. And maybe it's not appropriate to bring this up, but I'm still.
That's a
don't
you.
know what happened to that.
That's a you, I think.
That is exactly why we are really desperate to have that kind of frank discussion with the board and with the members. Because what's happened is that in some cases we have development has taken funds in, but perhaps something hasn't been expended yet, right? So we have to take a look at the funds that are in the CFD and to see if any of those are encumbered for something that hasn't been done yet, and we have to figure out how to allocate those, right?
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about entitled projects where there's an arrangement with the developer and the jurisdiction to pay fees, development fees, that when FORA terminates, those agreements are no longer in place. We've talked about this a lot. There's $70 million on the table.
Right.
So is that going to be addressed in the implementing agreements?
Yes.
You haven't mentioned it, so I wanted to make sure that you were A, aware of it, and B, handling
Yes,
it.
and that's one of the reasons why we need to have more direction in terms of which projects they're going to be responsible for, because they do have to come up with an alternative funding source for those projects to make sure that they can, in fact, be built should they need to be built for their mitigation. So yes, that's part of the implementing agreements to say, all right, you've got a responsibility for this particular project. I'm trying to think of, Marina I know has got a couple where they've already set up something with their developer that said, you were going to pay this to FORA, but you're going to pay it here, so that's going to continue, but they can't give those developers a pass.
Have we seen any of those agreements?
Yep.
You're on it? Cool.
Director Hoffa and then Director Ramers.
So I wanted to speak to the issue of PERS and if there is a successor agency, the staffing. So I heard last time several agency representatives here say they don't have available staff. That was one of their concerns about a successor agency. I spoke with our city manager, and the city of Monterey is open to discussing with the other jurisdictions should there be a successor agency of working out a contractual relationship. And then secondly, I think we definitely don't want to have staff who would be PERS benefited going forward. We need to have a clean break, a clean start. We need to be able to terminate our obligations and liabilities post June 20. So that's my view anyway. I don't think we need PERSable staff going forward after that. I don't think that would be a good thing, and I think there are ways to avoid that.
Thank you. Looks like there's a response, and then Director Ramers.
Yeah, if I may, that is exactly, we're on the same page with that. We know that not all agencies have capacity to take on different roles, but that's one of the purposes of our next meeting with the admin team, to find out where there are areas that we have jurisdictions that would like to take these roles on, and if they do not, there are alternatives out there. I'm going to use the Salinas groundwater basin as an example. They just simply contract out for some of the ministerial things that need to have happen. That is obviously an option for this group too, but again, that would be a decision that's made by the successor board. However, we want to lay out as many of these things as we can in the implementing agreements, so that to those things that we can get handled, we can make it that much easier for the transition to take place.
I agree with the Mr. Hoffa's comments about PERS. I think that there are other retirement kinds of plans that could be put in place for people that would be acceptable, and that would be a direction that I think might be good. I'm concerned about the implementation agreements, and I do hope that they'll come forward with understanding and balancing and honoring the basic Fort Ord Reuse Authority agreements and the statements and plans that were set out in the very beginning, that we'll still honor that as an overall process. I also am a little confused about dividing everything up now. I don't think we're ready for that yet. I don't believe that we're quite, I think that's something that's going to be happening definitely, and the agencies will be taking responsibility for a variety of different things. I'm very interested in knowing who's going to handle the cemetery and that whole list that we saw at the last meeting that indicated all of the areas that FORA covers now, and I'm very interested in that. But I would like to to encourage the implementation agreements to be put in place and the divisions be discussed, but I would not be in favor of asking the agencies to go out and begin to do their own funding at this juncture. I think we need to, that may be a step that the next FORA will be taking, or will, as we move forward the process, will be doing, but it sounded very confusing to begin to separate out funding and all of that at this juncture. So I'm hoping we can continue to work as a body, and as the implementation agreements are put together, and as far as plans and their transportation study and the various things that we have yet to see will be implemented through this whole process and not yet divided out to individual jurisdictions just yet.
If there are no other questions from the board, I did have a couple of questions. One did have to do with the timeline of the transition plan implementing agreements. It looks as though you're saying that you're anticipating being able to go to the admin committee with a draft agreement structure on June 5th and then have draft agreements to us on June 14th.
There's a couple, and when I say draft, I'm using a capital D on draft, because again, the legislation that may influence some of these things will be ongoing, but we want to have a structure set up so you can see where we're going with it. It will be a living, adapting document until such time as a lot of these issues have been resolved between the members, because we have to input that information in the implementing agreements to make sure that they will take place.
Right, so I guess I'm trying to get an idea of, because right now we are obliged to operate as if FORA is going to sunset on June 30th, 2020. So we need to get these implementing agreements in place. So I'm trying to get an idea of, it sounds as though you're getting, through the admin committee work, you're getting an idea of some of the divvying up and what's going to happen. So I guess I'm wondering, from the county's perspective, we would like to be able to start really working on what our transition plan implementing process looks like, and because there may be some back and forth with other jurisdictions to work out things like habitat or roads or shared responsibilities and funding. I want to be sure we get something reasonably soon so that we have some period of time to get those agreed upon and finalized and adopted by the various jurisdictions. And so that's what I'm trying to get an idea of.
I couldn't agree with you more. Okay. The thing that is hanging us up a little bit, and I, with all deference to the woman from Carmel, I understand that some of these things they may feel faster or slower than others, but if you do not as a board have a discussion about some of these issues that we're bringing up, it's next to impossible for us to put together an implementing agreement. We need to get a sense about, what the group think is about how you want to approach some of these very complicated issues. You've been together for 25 years, so there's some things that have to be worked out, and some of them are going to have more spirited discussions than others. But as I say, I think as far as the local projects go, at least from the admin committee, we felt like there was, a good agreement there. The same kind of thing, provided that MCWD comes up with things that are reasonable. That's pretty good. We think the HCP, the HCP habitat plan, that's also doable. There's just some of these other issues we need to resolve. So we're hoping, and I think that the executive director also felt the same way, that if we could have this discussion, that might help us reach these sooner. The sooner we can get those items discussed, the sooner we can start laying them out.
Is that a conversation for this whole board, or is it a conversation between the landholding jurisdictions that are going to have to work that out post FORA?
I'm going to defer to the executive officer on that one.
Because I'm not exactly clear what they are, but it just seems to me that if FORA goes away, it's just going to be us chickens here trying to work this out. And I thought that's what the implementing agreements were for the county to be able to talk to Marina about, okay, you're doing this development, that's going to have an impact on some stuff that we're responsible for, and how are we going to work that out? And those are going to be the things that are not just county responsibilities or not just marina responsibilities, but those shared ones. And then
Sure.
we have to do the same thing with Seaside and with Monterey and with Delray Oaks, so that all those issues are taken care of. So that's what I thought the implementing agreements were not so much, I mean, there is a lot that's gotten worked out by the admin committee, and I think as all of us came up with our own drafts of the transition plan, we all kind of came up with the same stuff. So it's like, I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out, is when do the jurisdictions get to sit down with each other and work out the implementing agreement between each other?
Chair, I think Kendall has keyed in on a good point, and you have eloquently described what is really an iterative process that's going to require both written documents to be exchanged and public debate to occur. I think there are two components of this process. The CIP process is moving along at the same time, where you're going to be making some policy decisions that will refine what may be in some of those agreements. And so I think that what Kendall's trying to point out is there are some clear implementing agreements that we know what they'll generally look like. For example, the one for the city of Seaside to undertake the Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement, or Marina, or the county, since you're all mentioned, or a collection of the above, has some specific tasks that have to be done. They're defined in agreements, and that implementing agreement can be crafted today, and a written document can be circulated. Similarly, we generally know, not precisely know, we generally know under Marina Coast Water District taking over certain obligations what that's going to require. We know what they are. We know what provision of water services are. That implementing agreement could be circulated, and the test of that could be done in writing to help people move it across. We may not know what roadways are going to be in an agreement that TAMC takes versus what Marina decides it wants to do, or how the county gets reimbursed for Davis Road. How does that structure? So there's another policy discussion that I talked with Kendall and thought that at some point when the board had the information it needed, that there would need to be a discussion that would probably be a joint administrative committee for a board meeting that allowed the professionals as well as the policy decision makers to work through those issues and to help inform the implementing agreements. So I think that there are two different steps. Kendall, I hope I described that
that's
accurately.
exactly right. And I think if I understood where you were going with that, yes, the negotiations on the final between the landholders are different. However, the board as a whole, which includes members that do not have property, still have influence on policy. And so we can't not include those other members in that discussion, though their projects may not be in their jurisdictions.
So, for instance, the things that you laid out on the slides, where there's some agreement at the admin committee that we should go forward with South Boundary, we should go forward with the intersection of South Boundary and General Gym and get the EIR completed. So the administrative committee has said that's a good idea, but you can't proceed with that until the board says, yeah, let's do that. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Exactly, and I think what Michael was saying, which I think is excellent. Again, twin tracks. We have the CIP happening over here on one column, and we have these agreements on the other. But as we have those discussions concurrently, they will influence each other, so that if the board determines when they look at their CIP for 2019-2020, that is going to have a direct effect on the implementing agreements and what projects they may want to see continuing in a CIP for 2021-2022, and which of those things would potentially be shifted over to another agency to take care of. All those things are interrelated, and without having that discussion, we can't say, okay, TAMC's going to do this, Marina's going to do this, the county's going to do that when it comes to those more complicated ones. The local road projects do not seem to be a problem for anyone, and the idea of collecting impact fees for those kinds of projects did not seem to be challenging for any of the member agencies. In fact, they were rather excited about that idea.
But I just have a kind of a follow-up to that. So I saw that as part of the discussion, there was concern expressed by some jurisdictions about TAMC collecting the regional impact fee as opposed to FORA collecting it, I guess. And was it mentioned or explained at the admin committee that on some level it doesn't matter who collects it, that those fees are regional impact fees. If FORA collects them, they are owed to TAMC to deal with the regional traffic impacts. Those are mitigation measures that are required through the base reuse plan. It's a funny discussion to me.
The two sides of that that were critical, right, is Monterey specifically and Delray Oaks representatives were concerned, number one, that the amount of funds, Sand City was agreeing on this as well, the amount of funds that could be generated by a regional impact fee by TAMC would be lower than those could be generated through a CFD because the calculations are different, right? So that's one thing. The other part of it was their understanding about the way that TAMC allocates regional funds. In other words, TAMC would say there are a percentage of funds generated on project for Fort Ord that may be used in other parts of the county because the mitigation for whatever's happening here is felt not just here, but regionally in other connector roads like 68 and other. And I'm sure that Todd could probably answer that better than I could. But
that regional ripple effect is true whether FORA is collecting the fee or TAMC is. But anyway, Todd, do you want to help us with this?
I can answer that if you like, but I just also want to know that the staff who were making the argument against the fees transitioning to TAMC didn't seem to quite understand or agree in the reason why those projects were originally on the why these regional projects were originally in the FORA fee. So I think that needs to be explained maybe at a future admin meeting because they are related to the CEQA mitigation for the base reuse plan, and that part of the discussion that didn't come up in discussion. I think that's one point that needs to be clarified for the group as they go through the process.
Director Moore.
Yeah, so having attended those admin committee, and John Gagliardi was there also, that there's so much misinformation or some communications that those meetings have been very, very helpful, I think, for all of our city managers and those with vested interest to understand the subtleties of what Mr. Muck is now saying to us and what you're trying to say, whether we collect the fees or TAMC, but TAMC does impact fees versus the CFD. But so two things. One, to have this joint workshop of the board and the admin where there's a free flow discussion similar to what's been happening at the admin would be very, very beneficial, I think, for the directors if we're needing to make policy decisions. The other thing that I want to be sure that that's happening soon, because we do have to act as if this CIP budget for 1920 is our last CIP budget. So to make clear at the admin committee, there was a consensus that to do the South Boundary Road and to make sure that that's accomplished and funded through the existing CFD and the General Jim Moore intersection. There was dispute whether we should complete the EIR for the East Side Parkway, whatever you want to call it. It's EB something. That was disagreed to. Some jurisdictions said, well, we need to use that money actually in the 1920 CIP to meet other commitments that we need to complete. So this CIP year, we need to make sure there's the $4.3 million for the stockade that we heard about. We need to make sure there's sufficient funding to make sure the South Boundary Road and General Jim Moore are funded and the money's in the bank to complete. We need to make sure that we've got sufficient funds that whatever it is that we have to give to LAFCO, all of those things. So having that discussion, I think, would be very beneficial. I would hope it would be a workshop type meeting, and I would like us to schedule it before we're asked to consider the CIP or our full budget, which are coming. So can we get that scheduled? Can we give direction to get that scheduled in the first part of May?
Let's try to do that, but let's finish up the question portion from the board and hear from the public, and then we can do that as part of our next round of stuff. So any other questions from board members? Okay, thank you. Anyone in the public wishing to comment, ask a question, or make a comment on this arena of discussion?
There we go. RGS has done a great job. We've been working for several months with them now in the admin committee, and what they've helped us to do is identify what the big problems, the issues are, and really try to simplify it down. And the CIP was a big issue. We've had a lot of discussions with that, and coming down to the consensus that that the jurisdictions would take responsibility for those on-site and off-site roads within their boundaries. That was a big thing because most of those are in Seaside and Marina, part of here in the county too, but we talked about that and we're very comfortable with that. The regional projects, we're very comfortable with TAMC taking over, but there's this misnomer that, okay, FORA is going to fund the regional projects, but most of those regionals, they aren't funded, and there's not a path to get those built. Like 156 is an example. That's $300 million to fund that project. FORA's portion is $16 million, and so we're arguing about the need to continue this FORA portion, but really to complete the regional projects, that's a TAMC issue, and they still have a lot to do on their end to figure out how we're going to address that. But I wanted to say we support the idea of a workshop. I think it'd be really beneficial to be able to sit down and work through these logistical and these other issues that are outstanding that we really need to address. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other member of the public wishing to speak on this gnarly topic? Okay. All right. With that, then we'll close public comment and bring it back. So I think we do have the transportation study to discuss under this same item somewhere, but why don't we finish up the progress report part first, and I think the main outstanding issue is this workshop, when it might be scheduled, and I agree sooner rather than later. We're missing a number of our board members, so I don't know if that's an issue. I guess one question I would have is whether a significant chunk of the May meeting could be this workshop, since we're all going to be here anyway. Many staff members come, but I guess we could try to find a date to meet sooner, if possible.
Through the chair, while you guys think about the date, the date is whatever we come up with, but I want us to be focused in our conversations, and because the board needs to make policy decisions, and we need to vote some of these things out to give directions to the admin. Coming in here for a workshop and we're just talking among ourselves and we have no indications to leave with any substantive answers to these questions, because these are good questions, particularly one about PERS. All along we were talking about extending FORA. No one thought about, does that mean personnel? Right? We just settled that tonight, that we agree that we don't think we will. But my point is that we just talked about that right now, and up until then we were going to extinguish it, but we wasn't sure the it's too late. The extension of FORA would mean personnel, and I think we helped to clarify that. But I mean, if we're going to meet, it should be 5 or 6 things that we can accomplish,
right? And
they should come with the agreements that we already accomplished. Knock those out. Let us know what they are, because right now we don't know what they are.
Right.
We asked and they said they're done, but what are they?
So I think that's a good point, and I think that would be a good use of everyone's time, is that we set out the issues to have a robust discussion, and the goal is to come out of the discussion in such a way that the board members feel confident that we have enough information to make decisions and direct our jurisdictions in terms of some of the issues to be discussed in the implementing agreement, so those can sort of get started, and also give us a sense for how we might handle some budget issues, some CIP issues, some questions of where we are in the PERS. Director Morton, did you have a
just to Ian's point is that the CalPERS obligation is a general fund obligation, and I know we've been grappling with it, and the transition plan says that we're going to fully fund that, and that's something that the Finance Committee is going to be looking at in this coming year, from what sources of money are available to the general fund to finance that. The discussion that Kendall was talking about is what's going to be in our CIP. And the workshop with the admin committee is primarily been the discussions about what's in the capital improvement program as to roads, what's that look like. So looking at your transition report or recommendation, a plan, whatever you approved with, you've already completed that you want to fund the PERS obligation. And I think at this point that I would take that as direction at the Finance Committee that we need to look at the budget and get that done. So I don't think that our workshop should be focused on things that are already done, policy decisions made. Whether it gets extended or not, we'll have to deal with that next month or the month after. But we don't have any choices as to this budget. But the CIP discussion, because those are really the responsibilities that continue for us in Seaside, Marina, the county, Delray Oaks, Monterey, South Boundary Road, General Jim Moore. We're all looking at those things. We need to have that in-depth discussion. So my suggestion is that the meeting, whatever first meeting you can get together, be really focused on the CIP and what are the ongoing obligations, similar to what's been discussed at the admin. Admin focused it out on water, they focused it on transportation, and then habitat. Let's dish through that and not bite off more than we can chew, because we might be more effective. And then once this board is able to make some direction, be it to our consultants, be it that I know I'm going to be taking notes if my city manager is here, I know what I'm going to be looking for the city of Marina in what needs to be in a contract that I want to enter into with Seaside or with the county or any other agency. So I would like to have our meeting focus on that. I think it's going to be much more productive. It's not to mean the second there might be another meeting about general funds and how you meet commitments, but don't make it overly broad and we don't get anything done.
To that point,
So,
Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious, what kind of format would we hold? Because the admin committees are pretty free form. How would we do it?
There are multiple different ways, but I think the chair in the past has suggested if we can have a meeting like that facilitated, it would be helpful to everybody. And so that was what I've taken that direction to be okay.
Great. Well, the executive officer has identified the possibility of either May 6th or May 8th, which is after the May 1st admin committee and before the May 10th board meeting, FORA board meeting, and we could have the discussion and hopefully reach some degree of agreement in the workshop, and then the board could take action on items on May 10th. Okay. May 6th or May 8th. So May 8th, what do we figure, sort of a 3-hour meeting or a 2? What do we think it's going to take?
Chair, either 9 to 12 or 1 to 4, I would suggest.
I could do 1 to 4. I can't do mornings.
We're leaning towards the 8th, 1 to 4.
I can also do May 6th, 1 to 4. I just can't do
Okay.
Okay.
May 8th, 1 to 4. That's
better.
winning so far. Okay. Mr. Wizard, you're all right? we
Thank
need you
Ms.
still.
Starfield.
But can you send your alternate that week so that we've got the policymaker represented in the. Would you be missing the FORA board meeting as well? Yeah, so I think you should send your alternate because that way they can be part of the discussion and be informed for the vote on the.
I will ask my alternate if he's able to come.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a little bossy, aren't I? Sorry.
The alternate's the mayor. I don't tell him what to do.
Yeah, I mean, worker
What
on
time
workers.
on May 6th did you say?
Actually, we're leaning towards the 8th.
The 8th is
8th.
better. I have a council meeting on the 6th, so the 8th.
Okay,
would be
so
better.
the 8th is better. So it looks like
1 to
we're
1 to
okay
4?
with May
1 to
8th, 1 to 4.
May 8th.
Going.
1 to 4.
May 8th, 1 to 4.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Okay. I have to shift something around, but it's possible. All right. So with that, then any other comments or discussion on the topics so far under 8B, little I? Okay. Thank you. So now let's quickly jump into 8B, small I, the Transition Plan Transportation Study.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, this is a structure to try to implement a transportation study that we would get information back to inform both this CIP and potentially other services that the transportation plan, transportation study would provide information to TAMC, all of us. So Jonathan will give you a very brief report so that since this looks like the last item, we'll be able to introduce before 5.
Chair Parker, members of the board, this will be a brief presentation. I'll just go over the background of the 2018 transition plan and how the transportation study is brought up in that plan, and then go over the proposed scope that's in the board packet, the proposed schedule, and then go to the staff recommendation. So in the transition plan, the resolution, specifically section 2.2.6, discusses needing for transportation modeling analysis. So basically it's described in about 3 main points. The first is that we're to complete a regional traffic modeling analysis to inform this last year capital improvement program. Another point is that the analysis will show for a lead agency on-site roads, their inclusion and their exclusion. And the analysis will look at how including or excluding these roads impacts the regional, the off-site, the on-site roads and ORD community. So about the draft scope in the packet, there are 4 major tasks in the draft scope. The first task is about project management and meetings. TAMC coordination is included in those meetings and management of the project. In the baseline analysis is the second task. That's about analyzing the existing conditions on our transportation network. That includes the forward on-sites, the off-sites, and some of the regional roadways. The third task is about projections, and the third task is about the scenario analysis. So this is where you get to really the heart of the study. So it includes the comparative analysis amongst scenarios, and there are 5 scenarios outlined in the draft scope. And then a trigger analysis that assumes an average annual growth. So when level of service threshold or vehicle miles traveled threshold is met, that trigger analysis will point that out if there's a specific year where certain roadways become deficient. A professional opinion, a PowerPoint, a technical memo from the consultant, evaluations of different types of transportation analyses. So you have levels of service, which talks about capacity of roadways. You have vehicle miles traveled that will also be analyzed. That's where the methodology is currently right now headed with the state legislation that's been passed recently. Vehicle hours traveled, and looking at congested vehicle miles traveled. So in terms of schedule, the proposed schedule is once we have the contract executed, this work would be completed in 2 to 3 months. And then in terms of recommendation, so the staff recommendation for this item is that you authorize the executive officer to negotiate and execute a service work order with Whitson Engineers Master Services contract for a transition plan transportation study, and that's not to exceed $150,000. And staff's available for questions.
Any questions? Yes, Mr. Wizard. Questions from board members?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see in, I think it's packet page 65, which might be page 2 of the proposal. It says the consultant is required to, and then one of the bullets further down says provide results in terms of level of service. Mr. Brinkman, your presentation referred to vehicle miles traveled,
Yes.
and the requirement by the state to do traffic analysis beginning July 1st, 2020, using VMT at the latest. So I'm just curious to see if you could help me understand where in the contract what we're requiring the consultant to do identifies from your presentation what we're going to be expecting to see back.
Sure. I'd refer you to page 67. And then under task 4, scenario analysis, number 4B includes those types of analyses, the level of service, VMT, VHT, and congested VMT. So that would be part of the deliverable we get from the consultant.
Through the chair. Maybe more of a philosophical question than I'm curious to know why we would want the results in a format which we don't intend to use or would otherwise be stale in a year.
Well, this is to inform this year's CIP. So the CIP that we'll be bringing forward May, June of this year. So the CIP, as we talked today, this analysis will take some time, but we may not be ready for a board action in the next couple of months. This information could inform us.
Well, I appreciate that, but assuming that this agency is not extended, that CIP will live in perpetuity. So using the measurement of the day, I would think would be important.
Yes. Yeah, I think I pointed out it is using VMT, and it is here in the scope. It's just also using level of service that's required as part of the base reuse plan. That is the DRIMP calls that we use level of service as analysis as well.
That last point, through the chair, that last point that it's required by the DRIMP answers all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Director Morton?
Yes, so we just discussed the need to do our workshop and look at what we're going to take on responsibility so we can develop our CIP budget, which usually happens in May, gets approved. This study, we don't have a contract yet, so we're looking at least 4 months before we're going to get it. Isn't it? Don't we get it after we've already had to make decisions?
So
It seems obsolete is my bottom line.
Yes. So the board typically approves the CIP by June of each year. There have been years in the past where the board adopted the CIP later than June, and it's not that the sky falls down on us and we're crushed or something. But
I do understand that. Let me ask it a different way. We just heard a report from Kendall Flint. I should call you by your last name, I guess, Ms. Flint, as our consultant, indicating that the local, at least at the admin level, that it was a consensus among our admin representatives that the on-site, off-site roads within our jurisdiction would be taken on as our responsibility, which means that we will be doing our own traffic studies, our own EIRs, consideration of what impacts we need to deal with. That doing this study, when we aren't going to be able to incorporate it in a 1920 CIP, and it's not going to be what the different jurisdictions rely on because they're going to be required to do their own impacts and their own EIRs, that the expenditure of $150,000 on a study as opposed to $150,000 to get something in the ground or to move towards our habitat conservation plan that's so underfunded, I have an objection to. And I don't think it's necessary at this time. If we are extended and we're looking at doing another CIP, but if the powers of the board are stripped away as represented by Ms. Damon's and Mr. Monning's proposed legislation, then even at that point, it may not be necessary, and we don't know what the final impact of that legislation is going to look like. So at this point, I would ask that we table this study and just have our meeting that we talked about, but we're going to address with the CIP, address our 1920 CIP as if it's our final year. And if in fact we get extended by legislation, then at that point bring this back for consideration. That would be my motion. Maybe it's premature because you haven't gone to public.
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, let's continue with the questions and then, yeah.
I'm trying to lead.
Mr. Muck, I know, other people have succeeded where we have failed. Mr. Muck and then Mr. Gagliotti.
If you elect to go ahead with this, I just want to request that that the land use forecasts in the travel demand model have significant impact on what the results of the model are, and would like to request that the assumptions included in future land use assumptions in the travel analysis zones are brought to the admin committee for review, so everyone's in at least concurrence on what's included in the analysis.
Of course.
Thank you. Mr. Gagliotti?
Yeah, I take Director Morton's point very well. I mean, I was in the admin meetings when this was going on. I guess that anytime we're going to ever do any kind of analysis, it's always just going to be basically a snapshot in time. And so in the admin committee, we haven't had a transmission study or not transmission study, but a traffic study done in so long that would inform us. It was asked and generally agreed that this be done, at least just give us some idea of what we're working with, knowing full well that things could be changed. But this will give us basically a snapshot in time. So that's why this was directed to be brought out. And I mean, I completely understand we're always going to be behind the curve, but this will give us something to start from, even though it's late.
Thank you. Any other questions by board members? Yes, Mr. Hoffa.
For Mr. Muck, so how important does TAMC consider this proposal as far as the work that you will need to do post 2020? And my recollection is you presented on some sort of traffic study maybe a year or so ago. Could you speak to
So the Transportation Agency updated its regional fee program last year, and we ran the model for FORA last year as part of its update. We don't need this for transitioning to TAMC's regional fee taking over for the FORA zone. That's already been done. That is in place. That is something that can be implemented whenever the decision is to be made. So this would be for FORA's use.
All right. Any other questions from board members? Yes.
Just one question, more of a clarification question. I see your point about the pertinence of it, and so I just want to ask staff, what is it about doing this particular proposed study at this particular time that would give us meaningful information for making decisions that we have to make in the time frame we have to make them?
Sure. So in terms of what could give us meaningful information from the study, so one of the deliverables I mentioned in the presentation is that it has a trigger analysis. So something board members have asked and members of the public have asked is for the Northeast-Southwest connector, when is it needed? So that trigger analysis would use the model, the current AMBEG 2040 model, and tell us, based on growth assumptions that AMBEG uses, when levels of service reach a threshold where roadways start to fail, and which roadways that are included in the analysis are affected or could be affected. So that is something that perhaps the board has asked. We know the board has asked before, and that information may help us in making other decisions about CIP projects and who wants to take on certain CIP projects, because these four lead agency projects, when FORA goes away, whether it's 2020 or 2022, there'll be someone else will take them on. So.
Thank you. That gives me some additional information, but it doesn't give me a reason to do it now.
Yep.
So I think that might have more relevant information in 6 months, but not for this CIP. That's my point.
Thank you. Director Reimers, I'm sorry.
It would seem to me, what I'm hearing you say, that the information gathered here, pardon me, would give the jurisdictions who will be taking responsibility for some of these areas an idea of where, as they go into their implementation plans, they would have more information on what they might be taking on in some of these areas. And is that a
So I think there are three things of this study, and one of the reasons why FORA staff is asking for this day. First of all, your transition plan that you approved in 2018 says this study will be completed. That's the first thing. Second thing is, this study is designed to address what happens when certain roads, not only the trigger analysis, when do you need a road like, and we know this is very controversial road, the Northeast Southwest Connector, but what happens if you don't build that road? What is the explode effect on the on-site roads, the roads in the city of Marina, for example, that are being sized as a 2-lane road, maybe right now, because there are certain assumptions that apply, all of a sudden are going to have to handle a lot more traffic because you're playing around with the transportation network across the base. That is the type of information that we're trying to obtain from this study. So that's why you have the on-site roads, the off-site roads, which are what happens to the county's Davis Road, for example, when you don't build a certain road. What happens to Inner Garrison Road along the university? Do you go from 5,000 cars now to 20,000 cars in the next 5 years, next 10 years? Is there something that can be done in addition? This is information. You can choose to use the level of service version, the vehicle, the VMT, or the other version. This is data collection, and it's designed to help inform the board's decision and actually the agency's decision as they go forward and you start making policy decisions to leave projects in, for example, a CIP, or try to take them out. And that's why we're asking for it now. So you got to get the 2 months in there. That's the time projection. It's not 4 months, it's 2 months. And that is there anything else to that? No? That it? Good.
Director Oglesby and then Director Morton.
Thank you.
I guess the question is to staff then is, we need this information so we can talk about the current CIP and what we want to agree to as we talk about this being the last CIP. And that's why I want to know, does staff believe this is relevant for this current CIP? I think it is, because like it was just laid out, Ms. Damon just laid it out. You know, we need this information before we go into these agreements. But I thought what Director Morton was talking about is it was coming after we had our CIP discussion.
It is.
And so, well, right. My point is, so either we're going to put it off, our discussion. I don't think we can speed it up because I think the report said they're going as fast as they can. That's what I'm looking for. Are we putting that discussion off, and then it doesn't become stale? But I thought it was a good point that they raised. But we need to do the study.
So may I? So to the point that Ms. Damon's just made about the impact of the south boundary, or excuse me, East Side Parkway, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be insulting, I don't know what it's called, East-West Connector. Northeast Southwest Connector. This connector is that's going to be evaluated in the EIR, and we don't need an independent study. Part of that impact is in the EIR of that project that's already funded. So that's a duplicative effort. The Transportation Agency just indicated they don't need this information for the transition of FORA going away for the regional roads. They did a study last year. They provided us to that. The other thing to the issue is at the admin committee, what was very, very clear, and I think it's also clear in the transition plan that got adopted, even though this direction was to do this, was that the local jurisdictions would be taking responsibility for their roads. We need to figure out what is the impact of our building. We need to identify what roads are going to be constructed because of that impact. This study is making an assumption that those roads are exactly what is in the FORA CIP, and from the perspective of every jurisdiction, that's what they're articulating in the admin committee, and we've been articulating in as we're going through this transition, is those may be the roads, or because when the work happens, it might be a different identified solution to meet the circulation and traffic requirements of our development. So at this point, we're still trying to spend $150,000 on outdated planning. It's not going to benefit us in the 1920 CIP because it's not going to be here for 5 months, and we need to make these decisions because we want to get these roads done in our last year, that Project 2 and Project 5 on the CIP. And in that discussion that we're going to have in this May 6th is, do we want to complete the EIR for the connector road? I just never know whether it's which direction is first. So I urge us not to spend this $150,000. I am so concerned as sitting in this chair here and on our finance and listening to everything that we have done, that we have limited funds and we need to be so judicious about what we are spending them on so that we make sure that when PG and Carmel and these other jurisdictions are gone, that the 5 of us are not straddled with ongoing obligations and no means to pay them. We need to address these other issues first with our funds. So I would like to remake my motion that we table this study for bringing it back if necessary at a later date and allow our work session to go through and get our CIP, the information from our work session to formulate our CIP for 1920.
All right, thank you. We have a motion by Morton, second by Hoffa. Let me go to the public, and then I'll bring it back to us for discussion. That's all right. Any member of the public wishing to comment on this item? All right, seeing no one coming forward, they think we've done such a great job already. They don't, nothing further to say. All right, so then I'll bring it back to this board for discussion on the motion, if desired. So.
Again, I don't know how we're going to talk about the CIP without this information. And talking about we don't want to waste the money because eventually the jurisdictions left behind need this money. Well, then we need to know the obligations of the cost of the roads and the impacts of the roads before we take on those obligations. So it's either now before we sign on, before we adopt the CIP, or before we break up. But we're not going to sign obligations for these roads, and we don't know the impact, the cost. And I understand each jurisdiction is on its own, but while we're still FORA needs to be taking on these responsibilities. So, my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffa.
I think that when we meet on May 8th, prior to that meeting, we should ask TAMC to share their study with us, and I think that will inform our discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, all right, so we have a motion and we have a second. Probably a roll call vote would be helpful.
Director Parker?
Aye.
Director Gunter? Director O'Connell? Director Martin? Director Adams? Director Phillips? Director Carbone? Director Reimers? Director Hoffa?
Yes.
Director Gagliotti? Director Wizard? Director Oglesby? And Director Garfield?
Yes.
Tie. Motion failed.
Does the motion fails, or we don't take the transportation agency? We don't take it forward.
Yeah. So, Chair. Yeah. Chair. Yeah, because it'll be the same. It'll be the same vote. So, do you want to bring it up?
What are the implications of the tie vote we just?
It was a 5-5 vote, correct? And the motion was to table the item. So it comes back. It's still an action item. If there's another motion to handle the item, then it should be made.
So, I make a motion that we accept staff recommendation and allocate the money to start this study.
Okay, there's a motion by Gagliotti,
Madam Chair,
second by Carbone. Discussion.
I have a substitute motion.
Okay. Yes.
That we approve, or we accept staff's recommendation, but we don't hear a CIP meeting agenda item until after the report's completed.
Wait, so let me understand. So you're suggesting that the study proceed, but that the board not take action on the final, on the 1920 CIP until after the study has been produced?
Received by this board.
Received.
But yes.
So delaying the CIP conversation until the fall, essentially, or late summer, whenever. Okay, Director Ramers.
I'm just going to ask, I've heard 6 months, I've heard 2 months. What is the range of time that we can get this report back?
Yeah, we believe it's 60 to 90 days, and I'm suspecting that the maker of the motion is looking to push that study so that it's back quicker.
In a couple of months. Okay.
Second.
All right, a substitute motion by Wizard, seconded by Oglesby. And I guess the timeline would start from when the contract might be entered into, which, if this is not a unanimous vote, couldn't be before a month from now. So, all right. So, I would just say that I too question the need for this study. We have had transportation studies relatively recently. We are going into our final year CIP. CIP projects about which we have, at least at the admin committee level, a certain amount of consensus. So it seems to me there's not much to study. So I don't see the point of doing this. If FORA is extended and has the powers to undertake new projects and all of that, then that would be the time to do a study to inform a future CIP. Exactly. That's my. I mean, I'm puzzled by why. And yes, we did have it included in our transition plan. You know, this board put it in. This board could take it out. I don't think that's anything particularly binding. But if we are going to go forward and do this study, I think it needs to include the Highway 68 corridor and the work that's happening there. That's going to impact traffic flow and congestion and all that sort of thing. And it seems to me, too, that the study should estimate traffic impacts related to each remaining FORA road. It's kind of listed as if it's going to be all or nothing. And, you know, as we all know, things change, things happen at a different pace. I think we just really need to understand the implications truly, not just some big package deal that actually won't be particularly helpful, in my opinion. So any other comments on the motion? Any other motions? Uh-oh. Sorry, I was kidding. But yes?
No, I don't have another motion. I do not have another motion. I don't know if I could even be allowed to have another motion at this point, but why not? I'm not gonna anyway. But I still have a question about the pertinence and timeliness of this information. Is this study going to give us the information we need at the time at which we need it? Or if by waiting a little bit, will we get a much better idea of what scope is needed, the breadth of it, whether it's all or nothing or some subsets, and we can fine tune this particular set of requirements in fairly short order. After the May 8th and 10th, everyone will have a much better idea about what the unknowns are and get ultimately a much better study. So, should I go ahead and make another motion?
That makes sense. We established the May 8th CIP workshop, so we can change that date. That's the first thing. We don't have to submit a CIP. We don't have to do a CIP at that workshop. So there's a lot of other stuff we got to talk about. It's just we don't have to adopt a CIP at that workshop. So to say we don't need to study because we're going to adopt a CIP on May 8th, so therefore it doesn't make sense. Well, if it's vital information after the CIP, after the workshop, then it's vital information before. We can move the date for the workshop or just don't submit in stone the CIP. Again, I don't think that the land use jurisdictions, it's going to be hard for Seaside to be agreeing to any of these things without this information. So when you talk about whether it's vital or not, then that's the answer. It's vital.
Director Ramers.
That's what I'm feeling too. I think it is information that if I were in a jurisdiction where I was going to make a decision to be part of any of these choices that you all are going to have to be making, I would like as much information as I could possibly have whenever and as soon as I could possibly have it. So that is why I will be supporting the yes, go forward on either one. I would not like to delay the CIP, but if that's the best way to go, I just want the information for you all.
And I'd like to just clarify, in the maker of the motion intended that the CIP adoption happen after the study comes. That doesn't change anything about our May 8th workshop or anything else, because I see that that will inform some of the CIP discussion, but my concern is the implementing agreements, and we have to get those going, and that's what I'm interested in having some clarity come out of the May 8th workshop on that. So I just wanted to.
The intent of my motion was not to delay or frustrate the May 8th meeting, only to provide information before we'd be making decisions that would be better informed by having regional traffic circulation information. So
the motion is to go ahead with the study and delay the CIP, the board's CIP discussion and decision until after the study has been given to us.
If you remove discussion from that, yes, that's correct. We can discuss it all you'd like. Just the decision on the CIP should be delayed until after the reports received by the board. Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
If we need a second opinion, a second vote, it could be done at the May 8th meeting.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to.
I just want to comment just to make clear that this study isn't going to change what CFD funds we have to allocate in this coming CIP year. So this study might tell you all kinds of things, but what we need to do and get started on is doing those road commitments that it seems that we're unanimously agreed among the admin committee. The admin committee is the one that makes a recommendation to the board about a CIP. And how they make those decisions is, yes, they're allocating funds over 5 years with the idea that it's a wish list, you're going to get those funds. But really, I'm concerned that we address what seems to be a consensus at the admin level, bring it to the board level, decide, and getting the South Boundary Road and the General Jim Moore, delaying the CIP as opposed to let's get it done if that's what our last year is, and those are the consensus that this board echoes what the admin committee says. This study isn't going to give us any additional information. And again, I really think that the $150,000 should be going to getting those roads done and meeting those commitments. And there are so many commitments, and we go in closed session, we talk about additional commitments. I'm trying to make sure there's enough funds. So I would again oppose this motion and urge that it's not necessary.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. We've had some discussion. It's the substitute motion that we would vote on. Yes, I'm sorry. Is to do the study and delay the decision on the CIP. Great. And so roll call vote, please.
Director Parker?
No.
Director Gunter? Director O'Connell? Director Morton? Director Adams? Director Phillips? Director Carbone? Director Reimers?
Yes.
Director Hoffa? Director Gagliotti? Director Wizard? And Director Oglesby? And Director Garfield?
So, as you may have noticed, it's after 5 o'clock. We need a motion to continue the meeting. And basically, the only item we have left is public comment. So if I could get a motion to allow the public to comment, should it so choose.
So moved.
Thank you. There's a motion by Wizard and various seconds. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Is there any public comment on this time on items not on today's agenda? In that case, then, we are adjourned. Thank you.